Okay, so large reasoning models, we've seen them get really good at complex stuff, right?
Yeah.
Using these detailed chains of thought,
Yeah, definitely. Things like mathematics, even programming, they sort of reason things out step by step.
like breaking down a big problem.
Exactly. That chain of thought idea has been, well, pretty central to getting them to handle really complex tasks. It's almost like how we might reason, but, scaled up massively.
But here's the interesting bit, and maybe the tricky part. These chains of thought, they can get long, really long.
Uh-huh.
And controlling that length isn't always straightforward, which in the real world can cause issues. Think about token limits or latency, how fast you need an answer.
Right, or just the sheer compute power available. If you've got a model running on something with limited resources, or you need a super quick response,
Or a massive sprawling chain of thought just isn't practical.
it can become a real bottleneck.
Which brings us to what we're diving into today, this new framework called elastic reasoning. The idea, as I understand it, is to tackle this exact problem, making chain of thought reasoning work well, even when resources are, well, tight.
That's the core goal. And what's really neat about elastic reasoning is how it approaches this. It splits the whole reasoning process into two distinct parts.
Two parts.
Yeah, think of it as a thinking phase first, and then a separate solution phase where it actually writes down the answer.
Okay. Thinking and then solving.
And the crucial bit is that each phase gets its own budget. Independent budgets for thinking time or tokens and solution time or tokens.
Ah, I see. So instead of just one pot of resources for the whole thing, you're saying,
Okay.
okay, model, you get this much for thinking and this much for writing the solution.
Precisely. And this happens at inference time, when the model's actually doing the work.
But it's not just about inference, right?
Right.
Doesn't the training change too?
It does. That's the other key piece. During training, they use something called a budget-constrained rollout.
Budget-constrained rollout. Sounds technical.
It sort of is, but the idea is basically to teach the model how to reason effectively, even if that thinking phase gets cut short because of its budget.
So it learns to be more adaptable, to work well, even if it doesn't have endless time to ponder.
Exactly. It's trained to be robust even when the thinking resources are limited, which, as you said, is super relevant for practical uses where you have those limits.
Makes sense. You need it to still give you something useful.
Right. And the results they've seen, well, pretty promising. They tested this on some tough benchmarks.
Like what?
In math, things like AIME and Math 500, these are hard competition-style problems. And for programming, they used LiveCodeBench, which checks if the code works, and also Codeforces problems.
Okay, so demanding tests.
Yeah.
And did this separate budgeting, this constrained training, actually help?
The results suggest it really did. Across the board, these elastic reasoning models performed well, even when they slapped some pretty strict budget limits on them during testing. They showed better reliability when resources were scarce.
That reliability point seems huge. No good having a powerful model if it falls apart under pressure.
Definitely. But there was another interesting finding, too. Sometimes, even when there weren't strict budget limits,
Yeah.
the models trained with elastic reasoning actually produced more concise reasoning. They got to the answer using fewer steps, fewer tokens.
Oh, that's unexpected. So forcing it to be efficient during training makes it leaner overall.
It seems like it, yeah. Maybe by learning to cope with constraints, it gets better at identifying the most critical reasoning steps. It almost forces a kind of efficiency.
Huh. Maybe there's a lesson in there for us, too.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to recap the core idea of elastic reasoning.
It's that split, a thinking phase and a solution phase. And crucially, independent resource budgets for each.
Right. And the benefits seem to be.
Well, improved reliability under constraints, which is key for deployment.
And they also generalize, like they work okay with budget settings they didn't explicitly train for.
That's another big plus, yeah. It means less need to constantly retrain for every possible scenario. Saves a lot of hassle.
And that surprising bonus, more concise reasoning even when you let them run free.
That efficiency gain was a nice side effect.
Okay, let's get into some specifics from the experiments. What jumped out at you?
Well, this one model, E1 Math 1.5b, the E1 standing for elastic, I assume it did really well in the math tests.
Better than standard approaches.
Yeah, it consistently beat baselines like L1 exact and S1 under different budget conditions. And it was competitive with another method, L1 max, even though L1 max often needs way more training time.
And how did it handle being squeezed if you really cut its budget compared to the original model it was based on?
That's where it's shown. The performance drop was much smaller compared to the original model when the budget got tight. And it did this using significantly fewer tokens overall. Really showed off the efficiency.
Okay, so strong on the math side. What about coding? You mentioned E1 Code 14b.
Similar story there. On LiveCodeBench, it showed really good scaling, give it more budget. It performed better, which is what you want to see.
And the efficiency?
Same pattern. Even with no budget limits, it got better results while using fewer tokens than the baseline. And it held its own on other coding tests, too, like Codeforces and Human Evolve Plus.
So it seems this elastic reasoning approach is delivering across different domains, math, code.
It looks that way. And they did some interesting digging to figure out why it works so well. These were the ablation studies on the math model.
Right, trying to isolate what part makes the difference.
Exactly. They wanted to know if the budget-constrained training improved the thinking part more or the solution part more.
What did they find?
Both parts got better, but the improvement in generating the actual solution was particularly strong, especially when the thinking budget was tight.
Ah, so it gets better at actually forming the answer, even if it had less time to sort of mull things over internally.
That seems to be the case. It learns to synthesize a good answer from potentially less extensive internal reasoning, almost like it learns to prioritize the critical pieces when time is short.
That's really interesting. So the training really sharpens that final step.
Yeah. And they also played around with the training budgets, like what happens if you give it more thinking budget versus solution budget during the training phase itself.
Trying to find the sweet spot.
Kind of. They kept the solution budget fixed at 1K tokens and varied the thinking budget. For the math benchmarks, it looked like a thinking budget of 1,000 tokens. So 1K thinking, 1K solution hit a really good balance.
So roughly a 50-50 split during training worked well there.
Seemed to, yeah. Another cool observation was how the tokens were used at inference time when they lowered the overall budget.
Let me guess, the thinking tokens dropped.
They did. But the number of tokens used for the final solution stayed relatively stable.
Okay, that makes sense with the explicit budgeting. It protects the resources needed to actually write down the answer, even if it has to think a bit less.
Right. And again, even with no budget limits imposed during the test, these E1 models were just more token efficient than the originals. It's like the training baked in a more concise style.
You mentioned one last experiment, iterative training, trying to train it again with bigger budgets after the first round.
Ah, yes. That was quite revealing. They took a model trained with budget constraints and then trained it again with larger budgets.
Thinking maybe it could get even better.
That was probably the hope, but surprisingly, no. The second round of training didn't generally improve performance. Sometimes accuracy even dropped a bit.
Really? So more training with more resources didn't help.
It seems not. It suggests that initial budget-constrained training really locks in an effective reasoning strategy, and just throwing more resources at it later doesn't necessarily refine it further. Maybe it even disrupts what it learned.
That's fascinating, almost counterintuitive. It really highlights the impact of that initial training method.
It does. So pulling it all together, elastic reasoning looks like a genuinely practical way to get these powerful reasoning models working effectively when you don't have unlimited resources.
Which is, let's face it, most real-world situations. It tackles that scalability issue head-on by separating thinking and solving and giving them their own budgets.
And the payoff seems clear. Better reliability when things are tight, flexibility to handle different budget situations without retraining constantly.
And that bonus of just being more efficient and concise overall, even without constraints.
The experiments on tough math and coding tasks really back that up. It feels like a solid step towards making these advanced AI models more deployable.
Yeah, managing the resources within the model's process seems key. Budget-aware reasoning, as they put it.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If we were more conscious about managing our own mental resources, how much time we spend just thinking versus actually formulating our answer or solution, could we be more efficient and reliable too? Something to think about.